Hey guys, tonight dim the lights, put the phone face down, maybe lower the volume just a little more than usual, and get comfortable. Because tonight we're talking about something oddly universal, mildly awkward, and historically way more common than you might expect. Tonight we're easing into the question of how often people were actually naked in ancient history. Not in a scandalous way, not in a History Channel trying to shock you way, more in a very calm, very human, very this is just how Tuesday worked sort of way. So breathe out, let your shoulders drop, and let's gently drift backward through time to a world without closets, without laundry day, and without the deeply modern fear of being seen without pants. Ancient nudity, as it turns out, was usually practical, sometimes symbolic, occasionally uncomfortable, and almost never meant to be exciting, which is perfect bedtime material. Let's start somewhere warm. Ancient Egypt. Because of course we are. Egypt was hot, relentlessly hot, the kind of heat that makes clothing feel like a personal insult. Most Egyptians lived along the Nile, surrounded by water, sun, mud, and insects. And for the vast majority of the population, clothing was optional in the most literal sense. Men, especially working men, often wore nothing at all, or a very small linen loincloth that barely qualified as a garment. Children wore nothing for years, not as a statement, just because fabric was expensive and childhood was sticky. Women typically wore simple linen dresses, but nudity wasn't shocking. It wasn't scandalous. It was just there. Art from ancient Egypt shows nudity constantly. Farmers harvesting grain, servants carrying goods, children playing, slaves working, all very unclothed, all very normal. And here's the sleepy little twist. The more important you were, the more clothes you wore. Pharaohs were absolutely buried under fabric, jewelry, wigs, ceremonial beards, and layers of symbolism. Not because they were modest, but because clothing meant power. Nudity meant labor. It meant sunburn. It meant you were doing something useful. So in Egypt, being naked wasn't rebellious or embarrassing. It was practical, it was economic, it was class-based. The elites were dressed, the workers were not, and nobody really cared. Bathing was communal. The Nile was a shared resource. People washed together, swam together, and cooled off together. Privacy, as we think of it, barely existed. And this wasn't because ancient Egyptians were carefree hippies. They were actually very concerned with order, balance, and social roles. It's just that clothing wasn't where they drew the line. Let's slowly float north. Ancient Greece, which immediately changes the vibe. Because if Egypt treated nudity as background noise, Greece turned it into a full-blown aesthetic. Greek men were famously naked, like aggressively naked. Athletics were done nude, training, competition, practice, all without clothing. Hence the word gymnasium, which literally means place of nakedness. This wasn't casual nudity, this was intentional nudity. The male body was seen as a reflection of harmony, discipline, and rational thought, which is a very Greek way of saying, we think this looks nice. Statues everywhere, perfect proportions, calm expressions, no clothes. And no one was pretending this was accidental. Men walked around gymnasiums naked. They exercised naked. They debated philosophy naked. Plato probably gave lectures to a room full of unclothed students, and everyone just went with it. Of course they did. Women, however, were a different story. Female nudity in daily life was far less acceptable in classical Greece. Respectable women stayed covered in public. Their nudity was private, domestic, and carefully controlled. But even here, the rules were inconsistent. Spartan women exercised, they trained, they wore short tunics or nothing at all while running and wrestling. Other Greeks were horrified. Sparta responded by not caring, because Sparta never cared. So in Greece, nudity was philosophical, political, gendered, and deeply symbolic. Male nudity meant virtue, female nudity meant something complicated that men argued about endlessly. And children? Children were naked constantly. No one thought much of it. They ran around, played, learned to swim, and grew up slowly acquiring clothes as they acquired social expectations. Again, not sexual, not shocking, just practical. Let's drift west. Ancient Rome. Rome had opinions, lots of opinions. Roman nudity was situational. Baths were central to Roman life. Everyone bathed, daily, together. Men and women often bathed separately, but not always. And even when separated, nudity was expected. The baths were social spaces. You met friends, you talked politics, you gossiped, you relaxed. All while completely naked. And nobody thought this was strange. Public latrines were also communal. Rows of stone seats, no partitions, no privacy. Clothing was removed because it would get dirty, not because of any deeper meaning. Outside the baths, Romans were more conservative. Clothing signaled citizenship. Togas mattered, tunics mattered. Being naked in public could be shameful, humiliating, or a sign of punishment. Slaves, criminals, and the poor were more likely to be unclothed, which tells you everything about Roman values. Nudity could mean vulnerability. It could mean loss of status. So Rome balanced between Greek admiration for the body and Roman obsession with order and hierarchy. Naked at the baths, clothed in the forum, and always aware of who was allowed to be seen how. Let's gently move east again. Ancient India. Here, nudity took on spiritual dimensions. Some ascetic traditions rejected clothing entirely. Renouncing fabric was part of renouncing the world. Jain monks, particularly the Digambara sect, believed complete nudity represented total detachment from material possessions. This wasn't casual nudity. This was disciplined, intentional, and deeply philosophical. Meanwhile, everyday life was mixed. Clothing varied by region, climate, and class. Many people wore minimal garments, simply because it was hot. Others were heavily draped. Children often went naked or semi-naked. Again, no one made a fuss. The human body wasn't inherently shameful. It was contextual. Sacred art depicted nudity without scandal. Temples featured carved figures in all states of dress and undress. The idea that nudity automatically equals impropriety just wasn't universal. Now let's slow things down even more. Prehistoric humans. Because before culture, before laws, before symbolic clothing, there was just survival. Early humans likely spent large times naked or minimally covered. Animal skins came later. Woven fabric came much later. Clothing was about warmth and protection, not modesty, and modesty as a concept evolved gradually. As societies grew more complex, as hierarchies formed, as property and status emerged, clothing followed. The body went from being a tool to being a symbol, and symbols always come with rules. So how often were people actually naked? Very often, just not in the way modern minds imagine. It wasn't about rebellion, it wasn't about shock, it wasn't about freedom in the modern sense. It was about heat, labor, water, class, ritual, and sometimes philosophy. Nudity was background noise, and that, oddly enough, made it boring, which is probably why it worked. As we drift forward in time, those rules begin to change. Cold climates add layers, religions add meaning, empires add shame. But for now, we'll let ancient people remain exactly as they were. Walking, working, bathing, thinking. Often unclothed, rarely impressed by it. And with that, let's slowly float onward, towards colder lands, heavier fabrics, and a growing obsession with covering everything up. But we'll take our time getting there.
All right, settle back in again. Adjust the pillow. We're continuing right where we left off, drifting gently forward through history, still asking the same calm, slightly awkward question. How often were people actually naked? And now the weather changes. Because once humans start moving north, nudity becomes less of a lifestyle choice and more of a seasonal risk. Let's ease into prehistoric Europe. Not the dramatic cave painting version, just regular people, waking up sore, hungry, and mildly annoyed at the temperature. Early Europeans wore animal skins, not constantly, not perfectly tailored, just when they had to. Inside shelters, near fires, during sleep, clothing came off. It wasn't precious, it wasn't sacred, it was heavy, itchy, and smelled like whatever animal it used to be. So people were naked indoors all the time. Families slept together, children wandered freely, bodies were familiar in the most boring possible way. And boring familiarity is important here. When you see the same bodies every day, they stop being interesting. They become furniture, functional, predictable. Which is why early societies didn't panic about nudity. They had bigger concerns, like not freezing, or starving, or being eaten by something with teeth. Now let's slide into the early Germanic and Celtic worlds. These societies shocked later Roman writers, who loved writing shocked letters. Germanic tribes bathed communally, men and women, young and old. Tacitus, the Roman historian, noted this with visible discomfort, which tells us less about the Germans and more about Tacitus. Clothing existed, obviously, but nudity inside homes, bathhouses, and during rituals wasn't unusual. Children ran naked through settlements. Warriors stripped before battle sometimes, not for spectacle, for mobility, and maybe intimidation, because why not lean into it? And again, nudity wasn't sexualized, it was contextual. That's the theme we keep circling. Context decides everything. Now let's drift east again, slowly, very slowly. Ancient China. Here, nudity becomes rarer in public, but not because of shame exactly. Chinese culture emphasized order, hierarchy, and ritual. Clothing signaled position, rank, duty. So public nudity was inappropriate because it disrupted visual order. But private nudity, completely normal. Bathing, sleeping, medical treatment, childbirth, all involved full nudity without fuss. Traditional Chinese medicine involved close physical examination. Bodies were studied calmly, methodically. Again, no drama. Children often wore open-crotch pants for years, which is both practical and a quiet reminder that modesty develops gradually. Now let's touch on something important: religion, because this is where things start tightening. Early religious systems didn't automatically condemn nudity. Many creation myths include naked humans without shame. It's only later, as moral systems become more rigid, that nakedness becomes a problem. Judaism introduced modesty laws, but even these were situational. Priests bathed naked before rituals. Marital nudity was not condemned. The issue was exposure in the wrong place at the wrong time. Early Christianity inherited these ideas and slowly intensified them. At first, Christian communities bathed communally like everyone else. Yes, even mixed bathing existed in early Christian cities. Clergy complained constantly, which usually means people ignored them. But over centuries, the tone shifted. The body became associated with temptation. Clothing became moral armor. Not immediately, not everywhere. This was slow, painfully slow. Now let's hover over the Roman Empire as it transforms. Late Rome still loved its baths, still naked, still social. But as Christianity gained power, bathhouses declined. Not because people suddenly hated bathing, but because public nudity began to feel suspicious. Private bathing increased. Clothing lingered longer. Nudity didn't vanish. It retreated indoors.
Which brings us to the early Middle Ages. And no, people did not suddenly become permanently clothed Puritans. Medieval Europeans were naked constantly. They just didn't talk about it. Bathing was less frequent than in Rome, but it still happened. Communal baths existed, mixed bathing existed. Yes, really. Church authorities complained endlessly, again always a sign of failure. Peasants slept naked or nearly naked. Whole families in one bed, no privacy, no separation. Children ran unclothed in summer. Laborers stripped while working. Farm work is sweaty, always has been. Clothing was expensive, you didn't waste it. And medieval art quietly reflects this. Biblical scenes with casual nudity. Adam and Eve everywhere. Bathing scenes that look suspiciously relaxed. The shame we associate with medieval Europe is largely imagined backward from later periods. Real medieval people were practical. Cold meant clothes, heat meant less clothes. Morality followed convenience more than theology. Now let's gently pivot. Royalty. Because royalty is always weird about bodies. Medieval kings and queens were rarely naked in public, but privately, same as everyone else. Royal children were often naked during early childhood. Nurses bathed them, servants dressed them. Modesty developed with rank. The higher your status, the more controlled your body became, which is deeply ironic. Now let's drift toward Islamic societies. Early Islamic cultures emphasized modesty, but again, context. Bathhouses thrived. Hammams were central to life. Nudity existed inside these spaces without panic. Rules focused on who could see whom, not on erasing the body entirely. Private nudity was normal. Medical nudity was normal. Child nudity was normal. The obsession with full coverage came later, shaped by politics, not scripture. And this is the quiet truth across cultures. Extreme modesty usually appears when societies become anxious about control, about hierarchy, about moral authority. Now let's slow down even more, because we're approaching the turning point, the early modern period. Clothing becomes cheaper, mass production begins, social classes blur, and suddenly nudity becomes dangerous. Because when everyone can afford clothes, being unclothed signals failure. Shame creeps in. Rules harden. Children are clothed earlier. Bathing becomes private. Bodies disappear behind fabric. Not because humans changed, but because society did. So when we ask how often were people naked in ancient history, the answer is almost disappointingly calm. Very often, and very casually. Nudity was ordinary, unremarkable, background. It only becomes shocking once we decide it should be. And with that thought gently settling in, we'll drift onward next time, toward the age when buttons multiply, layers thicken, and the human body quietly vanishes from daily life. But for now, just rest there, in a world where nakedness meant nothing at all.
All right, we're still here. Nothing dramatic happened. History just kept walking forward, one slow, slightly uncomfortable step at a time. By now, humans have discovered something dangerous. Not fire, not agriculture, buttons. And buttons, unfortunately, change everything. Because once clothing becomes easier to fasten, easier to layer, and easier to replace, people start wearing it more often. Not because they suddenly love modesty, but because it becomes normal. And once something becomes normal, not doing it becomes suspicious. So, let's drift into the late medieval world and gently cross into the early modern period. This is where nudity doesn't disappear, but it does start hiding. In medieval Europe, beds were still shared. Families slept together. Servants slept in the same rooms as masters. Children, parents, grandparents, all in one space. Nighttime nudity was completely ordinary. People slept naked or nearly naked because linen was scratchy, expensive, and better preserved folded neatly nearby than soaked in sweat all night. No pajamas, no nightgowns for peasants, just bodies and blankets. And no one thought this was improper. It was simply nighttime. Bathing still happened, not as often as Rome, but often enough. Public bathhouses existed well into the 1400s and 1500s, and yes, they were mixed. Men and women bathing together, naked, talking, relaxing. Church authorities complained constantly. They wrote sermons, they issued warnings, they threatened consequences. People kept bathing, because warm water feels good, and cold Europe is cold. Now here's where things begin to shift. Disease. Plagues roll through Europe repeatedly. No one understands germ theory yet. So people start associating communal spaces with illness. Bathhouses decline not because of modesty, but because of fear. And when bathing becomes private, nudity becomes private too. Slowly, quietly. Now let's slide sideways into early modern homes. Houses gain more rooms. Beds become more common. Families begin to separate at night. Privacy begins to exist. And privacy changes everything. Once nudity happens behind closed doors, it becomes secret. Once it becomes secret, it becomes morally charged. Not overnight, but steadily. Children who once ran naked for years are now clothed earlier, not because it's sinful, but because fabric is cheaper. Mass textile production creeps in. Clothes stop being heirlooms, they become possessions. And when everyone can own clothes, being unclothed starts to signal poverty, madness, or punishment. Now let's float over to royalty again, because elites always amplify social changes. Early modern kings and queens lived surrounded by servants, constantly watched, constantly observed, which meant their bodies were no longer truly private. Paradoxically, this made royal nudity more controlled, not less. Royal dressing became ceremonial. Undressing, too. Servants attended bathing. Physicians inspected bodies. Childbirth happened publicly. So, nakedness still existed, but it was regulated, formalized, and stripped of casualness. A king's naked body was political. A queen's body was dynastic property. Comfort had very little to do with it. Now let's drift into the 1600s and 1700s. This is where shame really settles in. Protestant moral movements push restraint. Catholic reforms push discipline. Social order tightens. The body becomes something to manage. Bathing decreases again, not because of disease this time, but because water is seen as weakening. Yes, really. Doctors recommend dry rubbing instead, which is a choice. People still get naked to bathe, of course, but less often and more privately. Nightwear appears, long shirts, loose garments. Sleeping naked starts to fade. And once nudity stops being daily, it starts to feel strange, embarrassing. Children are corrected earlier, bodies are covered sooner. Art shifts too. Renaissance nudes are idealized, mythological, distant. Real bodies vanish from daily depiction. You can admire a naked god, but not your neighbor. Now let's pause gently, because this is important. Humans did not suddenly become more moral, they became more regulated. The modern idea that nudity is inherently sexual or shameful is very recent. It requires privacy, surplus clothing, rigid social roles, and anxiety about boundaries. Ancient people lacked all of that. Now let's drift outside Europe. Indigenous societies across Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific maintained casual nudity well into the modern era. Climate mattered, tradition mattered. Colonial observers were shocked, offended, deeply uncomfortable, which again tells us more about the observers. Missionaries arrived with clothes, modesty rules, moral judgments. Nudity was reframed as savagery, not because it was new, but because it didn't fit imported values.
And this is where global nudity truly declines. Not naturally, but forcefully. Schools require uniforms. Churches require coverage. Colonial laws criminalize exposure. Bodies disappear under fabric, not because humans changed, but because power demanded it. Now let's gently drift into the modern world, the 1800s and early 1900s. Victorian morality locks everything down. Multiple layers, corsets, high collars. Bathing exists but is carefully controlled. Gender separated, private. Children are taught shame early. The body becomes dangerous. And yet, ironically, this is when pornography explodes, because repression always creates obsession. But that's not tonight's topic. Tonight is about normal life, and in normal life, nudity has vanished, except in bathrooms, bedrooms, hospitals, places where function overrides discomfort. Which brings us full circle. Ancient humans were naked often because nudity was boring. Modern humans are clothed often because nudity is loaded. It carries meaning now, rules, expectations. Ancient nudity was quiet, modern nudity is loud. And maybe that's the strangest part. So, when you imagine ancient humans walking around unclothed, try not to imagine shock, or freedom, or rebellion. Imagine familiarity. Imagine bodies seen so often they fade into the background. And with that calm thought, we let history keep moving forward, layer by layer, button by button, until the human body becomes something we rarely see, even though we live inside one. And that's where we'll rest for now.
All right, we're not rushing anymore. There's nowhere to go. History isn't in a hurry, and neither are we. By the time we reach the late medieval period, something subtle but important is happening inside homes. Not in churches, not in laws, but in bedrooms, or what passes for bedrooms. Most houses still don't have doors between rooms. Curtains, maybe. Wooden dividers, if you're lucky. Privacy is still a luxury. And because privacy is rare, nudity is still common. People undress because there is no reason not to. They dress because they are leaving the room. That's it. No philosophy, no anxiety. In peasant homes, everyone sees everyone else's body. Parents, children, relatives, servants. Bodies are familiar, too familiar to be interesting. This is the part modern people struggle to imagine. Because we associate nakedness with being seen, medieval people associated it with being home. At night, clothes come off, not ceremonially, not romantically, just practically. Linen shirts are folded, hose are removed, feet finally breathe. Sleep happens, and sleep is naked more often than not. Now let's slow down and sit here for a moment, because this is important. Medieval people sweat, they itch, they smell. Clothing is hard to wash. Water is cold. Soap is basic. So you don't sleep in your clothes unless you have to. You don't trap dirt against your skin all night. So nudity continues, quietly, night after night. Now let's drift toward childbirth. Because if there is one place where modesty collapses entirely, it's here. Women give birth surrounded by other women, midwives, relatives, neighbors. The body is completely exposed, handled, examined. No one apologizes. There is pain, there is work, there is no shame. This alone should tell you how different their relationship with nudity was. A culture that truly fears nakedness cannot survive childbirth. Now let's float gently into illness. Medical treatment in medieval and early modern times involves direct contact. Physicians examine bodies openly. Wounds are exposed. Skin is inspected. Again, nudity is functional. No one writes about it because it isn't remarkable. And this is why historical silence matters. We don't hear about nudity constantly because it wasn't news. Now let's move slightly forward again. The 1500s, The 1600s. Homes begin to change. Beds become individual pieces of furniture. Rooms specialize. And slowly, very slowly, nudity starts to get a schedule. Bathing is for certain times. Sleeping is for certain garments. Exposure becomes limited. This is where embarrassment starts growing. Not suddenly, but like moss. Children are corrected when they stay naked too long. Adults become aware of being seen. Clothing stops being just protection and becomes presentation. And presentation always invites judgment. Now let's talk about sleepwear, because this is a quiet revolution. The nightshirt appears, a long, loose garment worn to bed. At first, it's practical, keeps you warm, protects bedding. But it does something else. It inserts fabric between the body and the world, even at night. And once that happens, naked sleeping becomes optional, then unusual, then strange. And once something becomes strange, it becomes wrong. This is how shame works, not with shouting, but with habits. Now let's float out of Europe again. Many cultures outside Europe continue long traditions of casual nudity well into the modern period. Pacific Islanders, African societies, indigenous American groups. Climate matters. Custom matters. Children are naked. Adults are lightly clothed. Bodies are visible. European colonizers arrived deeply uncomfortable. They interpret nudity as immorality, not familiarity. So they intervene. Clothing becomes enforced. Schools punish exposure. Churches regulate bodies. And once again, nudity retreats. Not naturally, but under pressure. Now pause again, because here's the calm truth. Humans do not naturally fear nakedness. They learn it. Ancient societies did not need to teach people not to panic when seeing bodies. Modern societies do. And that alone tells you everything. By the 1800s, nudity is almost entirely privatized in Europe and its colonies. Bathrooms, bedrooms, hospitals, places where function overrides discomfort. Everything else is clothed. And because nudity is rare, it becomes charged, sexualized, moralized, regulated. The very opposite of ancient life. Ancient nudity was everywhere and meant nothing. Modern nudity is rare and means everything. And maybe that's why ancient people slept better. They didn't think about it. They didn't analyze their bodies. They didn't carry anxiety into bed. They just lay down, uncovered, unbothered. So when we ask how often people were actually naked in ancient history, the real answer isn't a number. It's a feeling. They were naked often because it didn't matter. And it stopped being common once it started to matter too much. Now just let that thought sit there. No judgment, no conclusion. History doesn't need one, and neither do you. All right, let's just keep going. No reset, no recap. The voice never really stopped anyway. By the time humans reach what we like to call the modern world, something very quiet but very heavy has settled over everyday life. The body is no longer just a body. It is a thing that must be managed. This doesn't happen all at once. There is no single law, no dramatic sermon where everyone gasps and grabs a blanket. It happens through habits, through expectations, through the slow realization that being seen feels different than it used to. In earlier centuries, nudity happened because life demanded it. You worked, you slept, you bathed, you gave birth, you got treated for illness. Clothes came off because they were in the way. Now, clothes stay on because taking them off feels like a decision. And once nudity becomes a decision, it becomes emotional. Let's slow this down and look at ordinary life. 18th century Europe. People still live in relatively tight spaces, still share rooms, still share beds sometimes. But something has changed. Children are dressed earlier. Not because anyone thinks children are sinful, but because parents have begun to think about appearances. Neighbors notice things now. Communities watch each other. And the body, once invisible through familiarity, becomes visible again, which is uncomfortable. Bathing still exists, but it is scheduled, controlled, gendered. Public bathhouses are gone in most places. Water is brought into the home slowly, unevenly. And when bathing happens behind closed doors, nudity becomes isolated. This isolation is crucial, because when something only happens in isolation, it becomes private. And private things accumulate meaning. Now let's talk about sleep again, because sleep is where ancient nudity survived the longest. For centuries, people slept with minimal clothing, nightshirts maybe, loose garments, but full coverage? Rare. As the 19th century moves forward, even sleep changes. Moral literature begins to warn against naked sleeping. Doctors argue that it is unhealthy. Clergy suggest it encourages impure thoughts. And people listen, because authority now speaks directly into the bedroom. So bodies get wrapped even at night. And once the body is always wrapped, seeing it becomes strange. Let's pause here, because this is the exact moment where modern shame is born. Not loud shame, not violent shame, quiet shame. The kind that makes people uncomfortable without knowing why. Now let's float gently across the ocean. Colonial worlds. European colonizers arrive in places where nudity is still casual, still boring, still ordinary. Adults wear minimal clothing. Children wear none. Bodies are visible, and Europeans panic. They describe these societies as immoral, animalistic, primitive, not because of violence, not because of cruelty, but because of skin. So they introduce clothes, uniforms for schools, dresses for women, pants for men, and they enforce them. Children are punished for being naked, adults ashamed. Communities are restructured. This is where nudity stops being neutral in huge parts of the world, not through evolution, through enforcement. Now let's come back again. Industrialization, factories, cities, crowds. Suddenly, people are surrounded by strangers all the time. And nudity among strangers is deeply uncomfortable. So bodies retreat further, layer upon layer. Uniforms, work clothes, formal wear. The body disappears under identity. And this creates a strange paradox. People see more humans than ever before, but fewer human bodies. Which means bodies become mysterious. Which means bodies become fascinating. Which means bodies become sexualized. Ancient societies did not need pornography. They saw bodies constantly. Modern societies hide bodies and then obsess over them. This isn't moral decline or progress. It's just a shift in exposure. Now let's slow down again, because we're nearing the present. Bathrooms become fully private. Bedrooms gain locks. Children get their own rooms. Privacy becomes normal. And once privacy is normal, nudity becomes rare. And once nudity is rare, it becomes powerful. That power can be shame, it can be desire, it can be fear. But it is never neutral again. This is why modern people struggle to imagine ancient nudity. We project our feelings backward. We imagine embarrassment where there was none, scandal where there was boredom, sex where there was simply skin. Ancient people were naked because bodies were everywhere. Modern people are clothed because bodies are hidden. And here's the calm, almost sad truth. Ancient nudity did not make people freer, it made them indifferent. And indifference is peaceful. Modern modesty does not make people moral, it makes them anxious. Anxious about being seen, anxious about seeing others. And anxiety is exhausting. Which is why this topic fits so well with sleep, because ancient nights were quieter in the mind. People undressed, lay down, shared warmth, and slept. No mirrors, no judgment, no performance. Just bodies doing what bodies have always done. resting. So when you ask how often people were actually naked in ancient history, the answer stretches across centuries. They were naked when it made sense. They were clothed when it didn't. And they didn't think about it any more than they thought about breathing. It was only when breathing became something to monitor that it started to feel strange. Now just let that sit. No conclusion, no moral. Just a slow understanding that history didn't become more civilized, it became more complicated. And complexity doesn't always help with sleep. So we'll let the past stay simple. Bodies visible, shame quiet, night calm. And we'll leave it there.
All right, we're not rushing anymore. There's nowhere to go. History isn't in a hurry, and neither are we. By the time we reach the late medieval period, something subtle but important is happening inside homes. Not in churches, not in laws, but in bedrooms, or what passes for bedrooms. Most houses still don't have doors between rooms. Curtains, maybe, wooden dividers if you're lucky. Privacy is still a luxury, and because privacy is rare, nudity is still common. People undress because there is no reason not to. They dress because they are leaving the room. That's it. No philosophy, no anxiety. In peasant homes, everyone sees everyone else's body. Parents, children, relatives, servants. Bodies are familiar, too familiar to be interesting. This is the part modern people struggle to imagine. Because we associate nakedness with being seen, medieval people associated it with being home. At night, clothes come off, not ceremonially, not romantically, just practically. Linen shirts are folded, hose are removed, feet finally breathe. Sleep happens, and sleep is naked more often than not. Now let's slow down and sit here for a moment. Because this is important. Medieval people sweat, they itch, they smell. Clothing is hard to wash, water is cold, soap is basic. So you don't sleep in your clothes unless you have to. You don't trap dirt against your skin all night. So nudity continues, quietly, night after night. Now let's drift toward childbirth. Because if there is one place where modesty collapses entirely, it's here. Women give birth surrounded by other women, midwives, relatives, neighbors. The body is completely exposed, handled, examined. No one apologizes. There is pain, there is work, there is no shame. This alone should tell you how different their relationship with nudity was. A culture that truly fears nakedness cannot survive childbirth. Now let's float gently into illness. Medical treatment in medieval and early modern times involves direct contact. Physicians examine bodies openly, wounds are exposed, skin is inspected. Again, nudity is functional. No one writes about it because it isn't remarkable. And this is why historical silence matters. We don't hear about nudity constantly because it wasn't news. Now let's move slightly forward again. The 1500s, the 1600s. Homes begin to change. Beds become individual pieces of furniture. Rooms specialize. And slowly, very slowly, nudity starts to get a schedule. Bathing is for certain times. Sleeping is for certain garments. Exposure becomes limited. This is where embarrassment starts growing. Not suddenly, but like moss. Children are corrected when they stay naked too long. Adults become aware of being seen. Clothing stops being just protection and becomes presentation. And presentation always invites judgment. Now let's talk about sleepwear. Because this is a quiet revolution. the nightshirt appears, a long, loose garment worn to bed. At first, it's practical, keeps you warm, protects bedding. But it does something else. It inserts fabric between the body and the world, even at night. And once that happens, naked sleeping becomes optional, then unusual, then strange. And once something becomes strange, it becomes wrong. This is how shame works. Not with shouting, but with habits. Now let's float out of Europe again. Many cultures outside Europe continue long traditions of casual nudity well into the modern period. Pacific Islanders, African societies, indigenous American groups. Climate matters, custom matters. Children are naked, adults are lightly clothed. Bodies are visible. European colonizers arrived deeply uncomfortable. They interpret nudity as immorality, not familiarity. So they intervene. Clothing becomes enforced. Schools punish exposure. Churches regulate bodies. And once again, nudity retreats. Not naturally, but under pressure. Now pause again. Because here's the calm truth. Humans do not naturally fear nakedness, they learn it. Ancient societies did not need to teach people not to panic when seeing bodies. Modern societies do. And that alone tells you everything. By the 1800s, nudity is almost entirely privatized in Europe and its colonies. Bathrooms, bedrooms, hospitals. Places where function overrides discomfort. Everything else is clothed. And because nudity is rare, it becomes charged, sexualized, moralized, regulated. The very opposite of ancient life. Ancient nudity was everywhere and meant nothing. Modern nudity is rare and means everything. And maybe that's why ancient people slept better. They didn't think about it. They didn't analyze their bodies. They didn't carry anxiety into bed. They just lay down, uncovered, unbothered. So when we ask how often people were actually naked in ancient history, the real answer isn't a number, it's a feeling. They were naked often because it didn't matter, and it stopped being common once it started to matter too much. Now just let that thought sit there. No judgment, no conclusion. History doesn't need one. And neither do you. All right. Just stay with the sound for a moment, because nothing new is starting, nothing exciting is happening, and that's exactly how this part of history prefers to be told. Slowly, without urgency, without any need to impress you or wake you up, just a voice moving forward at the same pace as ordinary human life moved forward for centuries. By the time we are fully inside what we call the modern age, nudity has not disappeared in a dramatic way. It hasn't been outlawed everywhere. It hasn't been erased by a single belief or religion or moral panic. Instead, it has simply been pushed further and further into smaller spaces, shorter moments, and quieter routines, until the human body, which once existed openly for hours each day, now appears only briefly, usually alone, usually behind the locked door, and usually followed immediately by clothing again. This transition is so slow that no single generation notices it happening. Grandparents remember bathing in shared tubs. Parents remember shared bedrooms. Children grow up with their own rooms and think this is normal.
And this is how cultural shifts succeed, not by announcing themselves, but by rearranging furniture. In earlier centuries, nudity existed because life demanded it constantly. You worked physically, you sweat, you washed, you slept in shared spaces, you gave birth surrounded by people, you fell ill and were treated openly, and your body was never really separate from daily existence. Now, the body is scheduled. It appears at certain times, in certain places, for certain reasons. And this scheduling alone changes how it feels. A body that exists freely does not attract attention. A body that appears briefly becomes noticeable, and notice slowly turns into judgment. This is not because humans become cruel. It's because scarcity creates value, and value creates anxiety. Ancient nudity was abundant. Modern nudity is scarce, and scarcity always feels heavy. Now let's slow this down even further and talk about houses again, because architecture might be the most powerful moral teacher humans have ever invented without realizing it. Ancient homes were simple, open, shared spaces. Rooms flowed into each other. There were few barriers, few doors, few locks. You did not retreat from your body. You lived in it among others. Modern homes are the opposite. They are collections of sealed environments, bedrooms, bathrooms, closets, hallways. Each space tells you what kind of body behavior is allowed inside it. Bathrooms say nudity is allowed, but briefly and alone. Bedrooms say nudity is allowed, but only with permission and usually hidden. Everywhere else says stay covered. And because people grow up inside these structures, the rules feel natural. No one needs to explain them. Now let's think about how this affects the mind. Ancient people rarely thought about their own bodies as objects. They experienced them as tools. You felt hunger, you felt cold, you felt warmth, you felt exhaustion. You did not evaluate your reflection constantly because mirrors were rare, distorted, and unimportant. Modern people see themselves constantly. Mirrors, windows, photographs, screens. And nudity in a world full of mirrors feels very different from nudity in a world full of fires and shadows. This is why modern people often feel uncomfortable alone with their own bodies, not because the body is unfamiliar, but because it has been turned into something to observe. Ancient nudity had no audience. Modern nudity always feels like it might. Now let's drift into daily routines again, because that's where the difference becomes almost boring. Ancient mornings involved waking up surrounded by others, standing up, stretching, beginning work, often without dressing first if the weather allowed it, or dressing loosely if it did not. Modern mornings involve privacy, mirrors, grooming, dressing before being seen. The body is prepared before it is allowed to exist socially. That preparation becomes ritual, and rituals create meaning. Ancient nudity had no ritual, which is why it had no emotional weight. Now let's talk about bathing again, slowly, patiently, because bathing is one of the clearest markers of how cultures feel about bodies. In ancient and medieval societies, bathing was communal, practical, and often social. You went to clean yourself, but also to talk, to rest, to pass time. Being naked in these spaces felt no different than being clothed elsewhere. In the modern world, bathing becomes something you do alone, quickly, efficiently, and then immediately undo by dressing again. The naked state becomes transitional, not lived in, and transitional states always feel awkward. This is why modern nudity feels fragile. It exists between tasks, between clothes, between permissions. Ancient nudity existed between nothing. It was just there. Now let's drift towards something quieter, sleep. Ancient sleep involved bodies close together, often naked, often touching, without meaning, without commentary, without self-consciousness. Modern sleep involves separation, designated sleepwear, personal space, and often anxiety about appearance, even in the dark. Ancient people slept to rest. Modern people sleep after performing, and performance never truly ends. This difference alone explains why ancient nudity feels restful when we imagine it. It had no audience. Now let's gently touch on something uncomfortable but important. Modern societies often claim to be more liberated, more open, more honest about bodies, but compare exposure. Ancient people saw real bodies constantly, all shapes, all ages, all conditions. Modern people see idealized bodies constantly, edited, filtered, selected, and real bodies almost never. Which means real nudity feels shocking now, not because it is rare historically, but because it is rare socially. This is one of history's quieter ironies. The more bodies we hide, the more obsessed we become with them. The less we hide them, the less they matter. Ancient people did not talk endlessly about nudity because there was nothing to say. Modern people talk endlessly about it because it has been made significant. Now let's slow everything down again, because the question we started with was never really about how often people were naked, it was about how they felt about it. And the answer is simple in the most boring way possible. They mostly didn't. Ancient nudity was not confidence, it was not rebellion, it was not philosophy. It was habit, and habit is emotionally quiet. Modern nudity is rare, managed, watched, regulated, and therefore loud in the mind. This is why imagining ancient life often feels calmer, even when it was harder, dirtier, and more dangerous. The mind had fewer rules to remember. The body existed without commentary, and commentary is exhausting. So when you lie there now listening, not needing to react, not needing to visualize anything clearly, just letting the words pass, you are closer to the ancient experience than you might think. Not nakedness itself, but indifference to it. And indifference is peaceful. History doesn't end here with a lesson. It just keeps moving. Clothes get tighter, rules get longer, anxieties multiply. But for most of human existence, skin touched air without meaning, without judgment, without a story attached to it. And stories are what keep us awake. So we'll let this one fade out slowly. No conclusion, no moral. Just the quiet reminder that for thousands of years, being naked was about as interesting as breathing. And breathing, thankfully, still doesn't need explaining.
All right. We're still moving, but so slowly that it almost feels like we're standing still, which is exactly how most historical changes actually happen, not with announcements or turning points, but with quiet adjustments that feel insignificant at the time and only reveal their weight much later, once everyone has already adapted. By the time we reach the point where clothing is no longer primarily about protection from weather or environment, something fundamental has shifted in how humans understand themselves. Because fabric is no longer just something you put on, it becomes something that speaks for you before you ever open your mouth, quietly announcing your class, your gender, your respectability, your obedience, and eventually even your morality. In ancient life, nudity was absence of clothing. In modern life, nudity becomes absence of identity, and that is a very heavy thing to carry. Once clothes begin to function as social language, the body underneath them becomes something that must be managed carefully,
because showing too much of it now feels like saying something you didn't mean to say out loud, something that might be misinterpreted, judged, or remembered. This is where the modern discomfort truly begins. Not because skin itself is suddenly offensive, but because skin has lost its neutrality. Now let's slow down and look at daily movement through space, because space itself begins to behave differently around clothed bodies. In earlier societies, movement was communal. People passed each other constantly in states of partial or full undress without reacting, because everyone's body was part of the same visual background. In the modernizing world, movement becomes performative. You leave your private space fully prepared, dressed, adjusted, corrected. Only then are you allowed into public space. And because public space now contains mostly strangers rather than neighbors, clothing becomes a form of armor, a way of controlling how much of yourself is accessible to others. The body retreats, not physically, but symbolically. This retreat creates distance. Distance creates mystery. Mystery creates fascination, and fascination is never calm. Ancient societies did not romanticize bodies endlessly because there was nothing mysterious about them. Modern societies hide bodies and then endlessly talk about them. This pattern repeats everywhere once it begins. Now let's drift into something very quiet but extremely important: posture. Ancient people carried their bodies without constant self-awareness. They stood, they sat, they lay down. Modern people learn to hold their bodies correctly. Sit properly, stand properly, cover yourself properly. Posture becomes moralized. And once posture is moralized, the body becomes something you are responsible to controlling at all times, which means relaxation becomes difficult. Ancient nudity allowed bodies to slump, sprawl, exist without commentary. Modern clothing encourages containment, and containment creates tension. Now let's talk about language, because language quietly changes alongside clothing. Words appear that didn't need to exist before: indecent, improper, exposed, revealing. These words only make sense in a culture that has decided the body is something that can be misused simply by being visible. Ancient languages had words for nakedness, yes, but they rarely carried moral weight by default. Modern languages load these words with judgment automatically. This is how shame becomes embedded, not through laws alone, but through vocabulary. Now let's drift toward education. Modern schooling plays a massive role in how nudity disappears from normal life. Uniforms enforce sameness, rules enforce coverage, bathrooms become strictly private. Children learn early that their bodies must be hidden to be acceptable in public environments. This lesson is absorbed quietly, daily, without explanation. By the time a child becomes an adult, the idea that nudity could ever be neutral feels absurd. And yet, historically, neutrality was the norm. Now pause here, because this is where modern people often misunderstand ancient life. They imagine ancient nudity as confidence, as freedom, as boldness. But ancient nudity was unself-conscious, and that difference matters. Modern people try to reclaim nudity as empowerment because empowerment is necessary once something has been taken away. Ancient people never needed to reclaim it. They never lost it. Now let's drift gently into the relationship between nudity and time. Ancient nudity lasted. It wasn't rushed. People remained unclothed for extended periods during work, rest, bathing, and sleep. Modern nudity is brief, in and out, between garments, between tasks. This brevity creates urgency. Urgency creates discomfort, and discomfort creates rules,
which is why modern nudity feels like something that must be justified. Ancient nudity justified nothing. It just existed. Now let's talk about shame again, but carefully, because shame is often misunderstood. Shame is not hatred of the body. Shame is awareness of being seen. Ancient people were seen constantly, so being seen lost its power. Modern people are seen selectively, which makes being seen intense. This is why even being naked alone can feel uncomfortable now. The watcher has moved inside the mind. Ancient people did not watch themselves constantly. They lived. Now let's drift into the late 20th century briefly. Mass media saturates life with images of bodies, but these bodies are stylized, edited, idealized. They do not resemble the bodies people live in. So real nudity begins to feel inadequate, embarrassing, not because bodies have changed, but because standards have multiplied. Ancient nudity had no standard. It included everyone. Now let's slow everything down again, because this is bedtime history, not a lecture. Imagine an ancient evening. Work ends, clothes come off if they were worn at all, bodies rest, no mirrors, no evaluation. Imagine a modern evening. Work ends, clothes stay on until privacy is secured, undressing is deliberate, the body is checked, adjusted. Ancient rest was physical, modern rest is conditional, and that condition often involves hiding. So when we ask again, gently, calmly, without judgment, how often people were actually naked in ancient history, the answer stretches longer than any single era. They were naked often enough that it stopped registering as an event, and that is the key difference. Modern nudity is an event. Ancient nudity was background, like air, like light, like silence between words. And because it was background, it didn't demand thought. Thought is what keeps us awake. So as the voice continues, slow and even, just let that idea pass through without grabbing onto it. For most of human history, bodies existed without apology. They did not explain themselves. They did not justify their presence. They were not hidden because they were not threatening. And only once they were hidden did they become powerful. History rarely moves forward in straight lines. Sometimes it simply folds inward. Clothing folded around bodies, rules folded around habits, walls folded around rooms, and slowly, without anyone announcing it, nudity stepped out of everyday life and into the margins. Not gone, just quieter. And quiet things, when remembered gently, have a way of making sleep come easier. So we'll let this part rest here. No ending, no lesson, just the steady understanding that the past was not louder or wilder. It was often calmer, because people didn't spend so much time thinking about the skin they lived in, and thinking less is very good for rest.
All right. We're still here. Still moving forward in time so slowly that it barely feels like movement at all. And that's fine, because history never cared about pacing itself for an audience. It only ever cared about continuing quietly, habit after habit, generation after generation, until something that once felt completely ordinary suddenly feels unthinkable, and nobody can quite remember when that shift actually happened. By this point, nudity hasn't just retreated into private spaces, it has retreated into specific moments, specific permissions, and specific emotional conditions, which means the human body now exists inside a kind of invisible schedule that decides when it may appear, how long it may remain visible, and who is allowed to witness it without discomfort. This is a very strange development when you stop and sit with it. For most of human history, the body was part of the environment. It was visible in the same way hands were visible, or faces were visible,
where feet were visible. It did not announce itself. It did not interrupt thought. Now the body interrupts everything. Seeing it pulls attention. Being seen inside it creates tension. And that tension hums quietly underneath modern life, even when no one talks about it. Let's slow down and look at something deceptively simple: walking through a house. In ancient and medieval homes, moving through space meant passing other bodies constantly in various states of dress and undress without any emotional spike attached to that experience, because everyone was used to it, because it happened every day, because it meant nothing. In the modern home, movement is choreographed. You check whether a door is closed. You listen for footsteps. You wrap something around yourself before crossing a hallway. And that tiny pause, that moment of checking, is where ancient indifference disappeared. Because once you start checking, you start thinking. And once you start thinking, the body stops being background. Now let's drift into the idea of being observed, because observation has become one of the most powerful forces shaping modern discomfort with nudity. Ancient people were observed constantly by people they knew, family, neighbors, communities that did not change often. Modern people are observed occasionally by strangers, and strangers carry uncertainty. You don't know what a stranger will think. You don't know how a stranger will interpret what they see. You don't know whether they will remember it, judge it, or carry it away with them. So the body becomes guarded, not because it is dangerous, but because interpretation is. Ancient nudity existed inside stable social worlds. Modern nudity exists inside fragmented ones. That alone explains much of the difference. Now let's sit quietly with the idea of mirrors again, because mirrors deserve more blame than they usually get. Ancient mirrors were rare, small, distorted, and unimpressive. They did not invite inspection. They did not invite comparison. Modern mirrors are everywhere. Bathrooms, bedrooms, stores, screens. And mirrors change nudity from an experience into an image. Once nudity becomes an image, it becomes something to evaluate. Ancient nudity was felt. Modern nudity is seen. And seeing is harsher than feeling. Now let's drift into something that rarely gets discussed calmly: time spent unclothed. Ancient people spent long stretches of time naked without noticing it, working, resting, sleeping, bathing. Modern people spend minutes, sometimes seconds, in between tasks. And this brevity gives nudity a sharp edge. It feels like something you must hurry through, something you must complete before moving on to the next acceptable state. And that rushing always creates stress. Ancient nudity was slow. Modern nudity is rushed, which is why one feels restful in imagination and the other often feels awkward in reality. Now let's talk about sleep again, but not romantically, not sentimentally, just practically. Ancient sleep happened wherever bodies fit, on floors, on benches, in shared beds. Clothes came off because they were uncomfortable, because they trapped dirt, because warmth came from other bodies and blankets, not garments. Modern sleep is isolated. Each body in its own space, each body wrapped, each body separated even in rest. And separation over time teaches self-awareness. Ancient sleep dissolved the sense of self. Modern sleep preserves it. This is why ancient nights feel quieter when we imagine them. Now let's drift back to public rules again, because public rules always reveal private fears. Modern societies write laws about exposure. They specify body parts. They debate measurements. This level of detail would have been unthinkable in ancient life. You only need detailed rules when something is already emotionally charged.
Ancient societies had customs, not measurements. They understood context, not inches, which again tells us that ancient nudity wasn't controversial enough to require regulation. Now let's sit quietly with something slightly uncomfortable but important. Modern people often believe they are more aware of bodies than ancient people were, but awareness is not the same as familiarity. Ancient familiarity came from repetition. Modern awareness comes from absence, and absence magnifies everything. This is why modern discussions of nudity feel intense, moralized, politicized, and exhausting. Ancient discussions barely existed. Now let's drift back to children one more time, because children always reveal the truth before adults do. Watch how modern children learn shame, not through lectures, through reactions, a covered gasp, a hurried towel, a sharp correction. Children absorb tone before rules. Ancient children did not grow up surrounded by those reactions, so they did not internalize them, which means ancient adults did not carry them. Shame has a childhood, and that childhood is relatively recent. Now let's slow everything down even more, because this is the part where people often expect a conclusion. But history doesn't conclude, it just accumulates, layer after layer. Clothing layered over skin, rules layered over habits, thoughts layered over experiences, until the original simplicity is buried, not destroyed. Ancient nudity is not gone. It survives in moments of illness, in emergencies, in exhaustion. Anytime function overrides meaning, which proves that the modern discomfort is fragile. It disappears the moment life demands something else. Now let's gently return to the question one last time in this part, without answering it directly. How often were people actually naked in ancient history? Often enough that they didn't ask the question. Often enough that it didn't need a story. Often enough that the body faded into the background of life, where most things that keep us calm tend to live. And maybe that's the quietest difference of all. Modern life asks us to think constantly. Ancient life allowed many things not to be thought about. And sleep, at its core, is about letting thought loosen its grip. So as the voice slows, as sentences stretch and settle, just let the idea pass through without trying to hold it. For most of human history, being naked was not an identity, not a statement, not a problem to solve. It was just a state, temporary, unremarkable, forgettable. And forgettable things rarely keep us awake. So we'll leave this part right here. No ending cue, no fade-out instruction. Just history continuing quietly the way it always has, while you do what humans have always done best when the world finally stops demanding attention. You rest.
All right. We don't reset here. We don't start over. We just keep drifting forward the same way history itself does, without checking whether anyone is still fully awake. Because most of the changes that matter were never designed to be noticed in the moment. They were designed to blend into life so smoothly that people only realized something had been lost long after it was already gone. By this point in the story, nudity has not only been removed from daily routines, it has been replaced by something else entirely, something quieter but heavier, because instead of bodies being experienced directly, they are now imagined, interpreted, discussed, evaluated, and compared far more often than they are simply lived in. And this shift changes the texture of everyday existence in ways that are difficult to notice unless you slow everything down and really sit with it. In ancient life, the body was a presence. It occupied space. It moved. It worked. It rested. In modern life, the body becomes an idea that must be managed, an idea that must be improved,
an idea that must be hidden or revealed correctly. And ideas are far more exhausting than presences. Let's slow down and look at something very ordinary: waiting. Ancient people waited naked or half naked all the time, waiting for water to boil, waiting for tools, waiting for others. There was no urgency to cover up because waiting was not a performance. Modern people wait clothed, prepared, arranged, even when there is no audience, because the possibility of being seen has moved from the outside world into the mind itself. You don't wait as a body anymore. You wait as an image, and images demand maintenance. Now let's drift gently into public silence, because silence has changed too. Ancient silence was physical. You heard wind, fire, breathing. Bodies existed inside that silence without interrupting it. Modern silence is mental. Even alone, thoughts keep talking. Am I seen? Am I appropriate? Am I covered? This internal noise is one of the quiet consequences of turning nudity into something rare. Ancient nudity did not require narration. Modern nudity always seems to. Now let's think about time again, but not in years or centuries, just in moments. Ancient moments were longer. People lingered in states of undress because there was no reason not to. Modern moments are compressed. Undress, redress, move on. This compression makes the body feel like something you pass through rather than inhabit. And when you stop inhabiting something, it starts to feel foreign. This is why many modern people feel disconnected from their own bodies, even though they live inside them constantly. Ancient people did not feel connected to their bodies. They simply were their bodies. Now let's drift toward another quiet change: lighting. Ancient life was dim: firelight, candlelight, shadows. Bodies were visible, but softly. Modern life is bright: harsh light, overhead light, screens. Bodies are exposed in detail, and detail invites judgment. Ancient nudity existed in soft edges. Modern nudity exists in sharp focus, and sharp focus is never forgiving. Now let's sit with the idea of aging, because aging reveals how cultures really feel about bodies. Ancient people saw aging bodies constantly: wrinkled, scarred, bent. They were naked around them, bathed with them, slept near them. Aging was familiar. Modern people rarely see aging bodies unclothed unless they work in care or medicine, so aging becomes frightening, not because it is new, but because it is hidden. Ancient nudity normalized change. Modern nudity hides it, and hiding things tends to make them loom larger in the imagination. Now let's drift into care. Ancient care involved touch, exposure, directness, washing the sick, treating wounds, helping the elderly. Bodies were handled without hesitation. Modern care is professionalized: gloves, screens, procedures. Necessary, yes, but also distancing. Nudity returns in care, but stripped of familiarity. It becomes clinical, which again shows that nudity itself was never the problem. Context always was. Now let's slow everything down again, because at this point it's tempting to frame ancient nudity as something idyllic. It wasn't. Ancient life was hard, uncomfortable, often painful, but bodily awareness was simpler, and simplicity is restful, even when conditions are not. Modern life is easier in many ways, but mentally louder, and loudness is tiring. This is why ancient history, when told slowly, feels like something you can drift into. There is less internal commentary. Now let's return once more to the central idea, but without pressing it. Ancient nudity existed because bodies were integrated into life. Modern nudity feels disruptive because bodies have been separated from life and placed into categories: private, public, acceptable, inappropriate. Ancient life had fewer categories, and fewer categories mean fewer decisions. Decisions are what drain energy. Now let's imagine an ancient afternoon. People resting, Clothes loosened or removed, bodies stretched, no clock watching, no audience. Now imagine a modern afternoon. Clothes remain on, posture maintained, awareness constant. Even at rest, the body performs normalcy. And performance, even quiet performance, keeps the mind awake. So when we talk about ancient nudity late at night, in a low voice, with sentences that stretch and settle, we're not really talking about skin. We're talking about attention. Ancient people paid less attention to their bodies. Modern people pay too much, and attention is the enemy of sleep. Now let the thoughts soften, not conclude, not resolve, just soften. History doesn't ask us to return to ancient habits. It just shows us that many of our discomforts are learned, not inevitable. And learned things can be unlearned, at least temporarily, at least enough to rest. So let the body be where it is right now. Covered or uncovered, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you don't need to think about it. And for a little while, neither did most of humanity. And that's where we'll stay. Not at an ending, not at a lesson, just at a quiet point in the long timeline where nothing needs to be done, nothing needs to be hidden, and nothing needs to be explained. History keeps moving. You don't have to.
All right, and we don't mark a beginning here because this part of history never really began in a clean way. It just stretched on and on through ordinary days where people woke up, moved, worked, rested, and slept without narrating any of it internally, without assigning meaning to the way their skin met air, because meaning was reserved for survival, weather, hunger, family, and time, not for the body itself, which simply existed as the tool through which all of those other things were handled. In ancient life, hours mattered more than moments, and because hours were long and repetitive, states of dress or undress lasted long enough to fade from awareness entirely, which is something modern people rarely experience anymore, because modern life is built out of short transitions, short tasks, short appearances, and short exposures, each one noticed, registered, evaluated, and then immediately replaced by the next. Ancient nudity belonged to hours. Modern nudity belongs to seconds. And that single difference explains almost everything. Let's sit quietly inside one of those ancient hours. Not a dramatic one, not a ritual, just a long, warm afternoon. Work slows. Tools are set down. Clothes loosen or come off if they were worn at all. Bodies sit, lie down, lean against walls. Nothing is happening. And because nothing is happening, nothing needs to be managed. No one checks themselves. No one checks anyone else. Skin is just skin. This is the kind of time modern life rarely allows. And without this kind of time, the body never has a chance to become invisible again. Now let's stretch that hour into an evening. People eat, they talk, they rest. Children move freely. Older bodies move slowly. Nudity or partial nudity continues not because it is chosen, but because nothing interrupts it. No doorbell, no visitor protocol, no sudden need to perform readiness. Ancient life had fewer interruptions, and interruptions are what create self-consciousness. Modern life is almost entirely interruption. Now let's drift forward slightly, not in years, but in rhythms. Ancient rhythms were predictable. Day, night, season. Bodies adjusted naturally. Modern rhythms are artificial. Schedules, appointments, deadlines. Bodies must constantly be prepared to be seen at any moment, and preparation is the enemy of indifference. Ancient nudity thrived in indifference. Modern nudity dies under preparation. Now let's stay with the idea of preparation, because it quietly governs almost every modern discomfort with the body. Preparation means anticipating judgment, even when no judgment comes. Ancient people rarely anticipated judgment about their bodies because judgment about bodies was not a central social activity.
Judgment existed, of course, but it focused on behavior, loyalty, work, survival, not exposure. Modern societies shift judgment inward. The body becomes a site of evaluation because it is one of the few things left that can be controlled, altered, displayed, or concealed, which makes it heavy. Now let's let time stretch again. Ancient people spent long stretches of life in the same physical environment, same village, same home, same people, which meant bodies were known. Known bodies are boring bodies. Modern people move constantly. Cities, jobs, groups. Bodies are unknown. Unknown bodies are loud. This constant introduction of new observers keeps nudity emotionally charged. Ancient nudity existed inside familiarity. Modern nudity exists inside uncertainty, and uncertainty never sleeps. Now let's drift into silence again, because silence behaved differently in ancient life. Ancient silence was shared. People sat together quietly, not filling the space with self-monitoring. Bodies breathed, moved, adjusted. No one interpreted these movements. Modern silence is often solitary, and solitary silence amplifies thought. Thought notices the body. Ancient silence dissolved it. Now let's slow everything down even more and talk about fatigue. Ancient people were physically tired. Modern people are mentally tired. Physical fatigue quiets the mind. Mental fatigue keeps it buzzing. Ancient nudity coexisted with physical fatigue, which made it easy to ignore. Modern nudity coexists with mental fatigue, which makes it harder to tolerate. This is why ancient people did not struggle to relax in their bodies. They were already exhausted. Now let's stay here longer. No transition, just staying. Ancient life had long stretches where nothing new happened. No new information, no new images, which meant the mind did not constantly turn inward. Modern life floods the mind. Images, standards, comparisons, and the body becomes the most immediate place where those comparisons land. Ancient nudity existed before comparison culture. Modern nudity exists inside it. Now let's talk about comparison without moralizing it. Comparison is not evil, it is natural, but it requires options. Ancient people had fewer options, fewer images, fewer ideals, which meant comparison had limited fuel. Modern people live inside endless comparison, and endless comparison makes the body feel inadequate even before it is seen. This is why modern nudity often feels tense before it even happens. Ancient nudity did not anticipate evaluation, it just occurred. Now let's drift back again to sleep, because sleep is where all of this finally collapses. Ancient sleep erased identity. You lay down, you slept. Modern sleep preserves identity. You remain yourself even in rest. Clothes, spaces, boundaries. Ancient nudity allowed the self to dissolve into the night. Modern modesty carries the self into it, and carrying the self is tiring. Now let's hold this idea without pushing it anywhere. Ancient nudity was not about courage, it was about absence of mental noise. Modern discomfort is not about morality, it is about excess mental noise. And noise, even quiet noise, keeps the nervous system alert. This is why talking about ancient life slowly, without drama, without lessons, without conclusions, feels calming. There is less to manage, less to decide, less to interpret. Ancient nudity was one of many things that did not require interpretation. It existed in the same category as weather, fire, and sleep. Necessary, present, unremarkable. Now let's just keep going, without closing, because history did not close this chapter. It simply layered over it. Clothes over skin, rules over habits, thoughts over experiences. The old simplicity is still underneath, but it rarely surfaces, except sometimes at night, when nothing is required, when no one is watching, when the body can exist without explanation. That moment, quiet and brief, is closer to ancient life than most people realize, and you don't need to do anything to reach it. You just stop narrating. And narration is optional. So the voice continues or it fades. It doesn't matter. The past is not asking to be resolved. It is only reminding you that for most of human time, the body did not interrupt thought. And a body that does not interrupt thought is a body that allows rest. So we'll stay here. No ending, no summary, just time passing the way it always has, slowly, steadily, without needing permission. And you don't need to follow it anywhere. You can just stay still.
All right, we are not restarting, we are not summarizing, and we are definitely not hurrying, because the entire point of this part of history, and honestly of this entire topic, is that nothing was rushed, nothing was compressed into neat segments, and nothing was constantly evaluated for how it appeared from the outside, which is exactly why modern people struggle so much to imagine it without accidentally projecting their own discomfort backward onto a world that simply did not operate that way. In ancient daily life, hours did not feel empty just because nothing dramatic was happening, and bodies did not feel exposed just because skin was visible, because exposure as a concept requires an observer who is mentally detached enough to turn another human being into an object of attention, rather than simply another presence sharing the same physical space, the same heat, the same smells, the same fatigue, and the same slow passing of time. Most ancient people lived in a state of constant physical proximity, not just to other people, but to animals, tools, fire, dirt, water, and weather. And when your body is one element among many in a crowded sensory environment, it does not rise to the level of something that needs special management. It simply does its job, which is to move you through the day and keep you alive long enough to sleep and do it again tomorrow. This is why nudity in ancient history cannot be understood as a choice in the modern sense, because choice implies reflection, and reflection implies distance, and ancient life rarely provided enough distance from physical existence for the body to become an abstract thing that could be debated, regulated, or morally evaluated in the way later societies would become so very good at doing. Let's stretch out a single ordinary day, not because it is special, but because it is not. Morning arrives slowly, not with alarms, but with light, sound, and movement. People wake when their surroundings wake. Clothing, if it exists, is loose, reused, practical, and not particularly precious, which means it is put on and taken off without ceremony, without identity attached to it, and without the idea that the body underneath needs to be concealed for its own good. Bodies wake up stiff. They stretch, they scratch, they move. Skin is exposed because skin is always exposed to something, whether it is air, fabric, or heat, and ancient people did not attach symbolic meaning to which of those things happened to be touching it at a given moment. Work begins slowly, unevenly, with pauses built into it, and during these pauses, people sit, squat, lean, lie down, and adjust their bodies in whatever way feels necessary, which often involves removing clothing simply because it gets in the way, traps heat, restricts movement, or becomes uncomfortable when damp or dirty. And none of this feels notable. No one is tracking how long anyone stays undressed. No one is mentally bookmarking these moments. They are not events. They are just conditions. This is a crucial distinction because modern nudity almost always feels like an event, something that starts and ends, something that happens inside a mental spotlight, something that carries emotional weight simply by occurring, whereas ancient nudity rarely reached the threshold of significance required to be remembered as anything other than background. As the day continues, bodies move through shared spaces that do not sharply separate public from private, because such distinctions require architecture, social complexity, and a level of individualism that most ancient societies had not yet developed, which means people see each other constantly in all states of physical existence without reacting, because reaction would be exhausting, unnecessary, and socially disruptive. Children grow up inside this environment, which means their baseline understanding of the human body includes diversity, aging, injury, asymmetry, and imperfection, all observed without commentary, which prevents the formation of the kind of idealized body image that only emerges in cultures where bodies are hidden most of the time and revealed selectively, usually in stylized or symbolic contexts. As the afternoon drags on, heat builds, fatigue deepens, and clothing becomes even less relevant because comfort takes precedence over appearance in societies where appearance is not yet a primary social currency. And when comfort is prioritized, the body naturally seeks the state that allows it to function with the least resistance. Ancient nudity in this sense is not philosophical, it is ergonomic. Bodies exist in the state that allows them to keep going. Now let's slow down even more and sit inside the long, dull middle of the day, the part modern narratives always skip because nothing happens there, and that is precisely where ancient nudity lived most comfortably, inside hours that were not marked by novelty, performance, or observation. People wait, they rest, they do nothing, and during nothing, the body fades from attention. This fading is the key difference. Modern people rarely experience their bodies fading from attention because modern life constantly reintroduces the body as a problem to be solved, an image to be managed, or a boundary to be enforced, whereas ancient life allowed the body to disappear into routine. As evening approaches, tasks slow again, and people gather, not for spectacle, but for proximity, for shared warmth, shared food, shared silence. And in these moments, clothing remains secondary because bodies are not being evaluated. They are being used, leaned against, slept beside, and depended upon. Sleeping arrangements reflect this same logic. Bodies cluster, they share space, they generate heat. Clothing comes off not as a symbolic act, but as a practical one, because sleep is about letting the body do what it needs to do, not about maintaining an image. And when sleep arrives, identity dissolves in a way modern people rarely experience, because ancient sleep did not preserve the self as carefully as modern sleep does. Throughout all of this, no one is asking whether it is appropriate. That question does not exist yet. Appropriateness only becomes relevant once a society develops strong internal divisions between acceptable and unacceptable appearances, and those divisions only emerge when bodies stop being familiar and start being symbolic. Ancient bodies were familiar, endlessly familiar, which made them quiet. Now let's talk about quiet, because quiet is where this entire topic actually lives. Ancient quiet was external, the absence of noise. Modern quiet is internal, the absence of stimulation. And these two kinds of quiet produce very different relationships with the body. In external quiet, the body blends in. In internal quiet, the body becomes loud. This is why modern people often become more aware of their bodies when trying to relax, whereas ancient people relaxed by default because there was nothing pulling their attention inward. As centuries pass, slowly, unevenly, without clear borders, societies grow more complex, spaces become more specialized, and bodies begin to be sorted into contexts, which introduces the idea that the same body can mean different things in different places, which is the beginning of discomfort. Because once meaning attaches to exposure, exposure can no longer be neutral. But for a very long time, much longer than most people realize, this sorting simply did not exist at the scale required to make nudity emotionally heavy. Bodies moved where they were needed, they existed where they fit, they rested where there was room, and because this was normal, it was not discussed. History books rarely record what was not discussed, which is why modern people struggle to find explicit statements about ancient nudity. The silence is the evidence. If it had been controversial, someone would have complained, someone would have legislated, someone would have moralized. Instead, we find long stretches of nothing, and nothing in historical terms often means acceptance. As night deepens, the world grows quieter, and bodies settle into sleep without internal commentary, without rehearsal, without anticipation of being seen, because ancient nights did not carry the same sense of exposure that modern nights do, where privacy must be actively constructed rather than assumed. Ancient people did not need to convince themselves that it was safe to rest in their bodies. They already knew, and that knowledge was not intellectual, it was lived. So when we talk about how often people were actually naked in ancient history, the most honest answer is not a number, not a percentage, not a statistic, but a description of rhythm, of duration, of familiarity, of how rarely the state of being clothed or unclothed rose to the level of conscious awareness. They were naked often enough that it blended into time, often enough that it did not interrupt thought, often enough that it did not need explanation. And that is the part modern minds struggle with, because modern life trains us to notice ourselves constantly, to monitor, adjust, and interpret our own physical existence, which makes the idea of not noticing feel foreign, even impossible. But for most of human history, not noticing was the default. Bodies did not announce themselves, they did not apologize, they did not perform. They simply carried people through long, unremarkable days, and those days piled up, year after year, generation after generation, quietly.
All right. We don't move forward with urgency here because urgency is a modern habit, and what we're sitting inside now is the opposite of that. A stretch of human existence where days repeated themselves with such consistency that novelty wore off quickly and attention settled only on what truly demanded it, leaving everything else, including the body itself, to fade into the background of lived experience. Ancient time did not feel segmented. It felt layered. Morning felt like yesterday's morning. Evening felt like the evening before that. And because repetition dulls awareness, the body, which never really changed from one day to the next, stopped announcing itself entirely. This is where nudity becomes almost irrelevant as a concept, because relevance requires contrast, and ancient life offered very little contrast between one state of being and another. Clothed, unclothed, working, resting. These were not opposing categories. They flowed into each other. A garment went on, a garment came off. No internal note was made, and because no note was made, no memory formed. Modern people remembered nudity because it interrupts routine. Ancient people forgot it because it was part of routine. Let's sit inside that repetition for a while, because repetition is where modern minds get restless, and restlessness is the clearest sign of how different our relationship with time has become. Ancient people woke up and knew roughly what the day would bring: the same work, the same people, the same spaces. And when life becomes predictable, attention shifts away from the self and toward the task, which means the body becomes something you inhabit without commentary, without supervision, without constant checking. Modern people, by contrast, are trained to notice variation, to seek difference, to mark moments, and this habit pulls attention inward, where the body waits, always ready to become something that needs adjustment. Ancient nudity existed before this inward turn. Now let's drift slowly through movement, not dramatic movement, just ordinary walking, because walking reveals how bodies are treated by a culture. Ancient people walked slowly, not because they were lazy, but because there was nowhere else to be. Walking was not a transition between important moments, it was the moment. And when walking is the moment, the body becomes a vehicle, not an image. Feet hit ground, muscles move, breathing finds its rhythm. Clothing, if present, follows along loosely,
And if absent, no mental alarm sounds, because nothing about the situation has changed enough to warrant attention. Modern walking is usually a transition from one appointment to another, from one obligation to the next, and transitions invite self-awareness. Ancient walking dissolved it. Now let's stay with labor for a while, because labor occupies most of ancient life, and labor has a way of flattening distinctions that seem important in theory. Working bodies sweat, they bend, they strain. Clothing interferes with this, so it is adjusted, loosened, removed. Not as an act of rebellion, not as an expression, as maintenance. And when something is done for maintenance often enough, it stops carrying meaning. Ancient nudity was maintenance. Modern nudity is symbolism. Now let's slow down inside rest again, because rest behaved differently too. Ancient rest was collective. People rested near each other, not always touching, but close enough that bodies remained part of the shared environment. Modern rest is isolated. Rooms, doors, boundaries. Isolation intensifies awareness. Collective rest diffuses it. This is why ancient nudity persisted even during rest, because rest did not imply withdrawal from the group, and withdrawal is where modern self-consciousness thrives. Ancient rest was simply a pause in movement, not a retreat into privacy. Now let's talk about privacy carefully, because privacy is often confused with comfort. Ancient people had very little privacy, but they were not necessarily uncomfortable. Modern people have more privacy than any humans before them, and yet discomfort with the body is widespread. This tells us something important. Comfort does not come from being unseen. It comes from being unjudged. Ancient people were seen constantly, but judged rarely for their bodies. Modern people are seen less often, but judged more intensely, even when the judge is their own mind. Ancient nudity survived because judgment was focused elsewhere. Now let's drift into seasons, because seasons shaped ancient life more than abstract rules ever did. Summer arrived, heat increased, clothing decreased. Winter arrived, cold increased, clothing returned. No ideology attached, no debate, no moral panic. The body responded to environment, not to social meaning. Modern life often ignores environment in favor of consistency, climate-controlled spaces, standardized dress, which means the body is no longer allowed to respond naturally, and when natural responses are suppressed, tension builds. Ancient nudity released that tension. Now let's stay in summer for a while, because summer reveals everything. Long days, heat, slow movement. Ancient summer life unfolded outdoors, where bodies existed in full view for hours at a time, not because anyone wanted to be seen, but because that is where life happened. Fields, rivers, courtyards. Bodies became part of the landscape. Modern people rarely experience this. Outdoor life is scheduled, recreational, time-limited, and when something is time-limited, it becomes precious. Ancient nudity was not precious, it was abundant. Now let's let the day stretch into night again. Darkness falls, light fades, bodies become shapes rather than details. Ancient nights were forgiving. They softened outlines. They blurred differences. Modern nights are bright. Artificial light exposes everything equally, which again pulls attention back to form. Ancient nudity existed in shadow. Modern nudity exists under scrutiny. Now let's stay here in this low light, because this is where the modern imagination often fails. Ancient people did not need to hide bodies at night. They were already softened by darkness, and because they were softened, they were less interesting.
Modern bodies remain visible even in darkness, which makes them harder to ignore. Now let's drift into illness, because illness strips away social performance. Ancient illness happened in public. Bodies weakened, clothing removed, care given. No one flinched. Illness returned nudity to the center of life temporarily, reminding everyone that the body is functional before it is symbolic. Modern illness is hidden. Hospitals, rooms, screens. Necessary, yes, but distancing. Ancient illness reinforced familiarity. Modern illness reinforces separation, and separation breeds discomfort. Now let's slow down again. No transition, just staying. Ancient life was full of staying. Staying in places, staying with people, staying in routines. This staying allowed the body to become unremarkable. Modern life moves constantly. Movement refreshes attention. Attention refreshes discomfort. Ancient nudity faded because attention faded. Modern nudity persists as a problem because attention never rests. Now let's circle back, gently, without concluding. For most of human history, bodies were not interesting enough to worry about. They were tools, they were companions, they were burdens, but they were not statements. Only once life became abstract enough to allow people to think about bodies instead of simply living in them did nudity become complicated. And complication is not inevitable. It is historical, which means it came from somewhere. And things that come from somewhere can, at least briefly, be set down. So, as this part continues, slow and unhurried, just let the repetition do its work. Ancient days repeated, bodies repeated, habits repeated, and repetition smoothed everything down. Edges disappeared, awareness softened, and that softness, more than any philosophy or belief, is what allowed ancient people to live inside their bodies without friction. No celebration, no condemnation, just existence. And existence, when it is not constantly interpreted, is very good.
All right. We don't speed up here, but we do smooth things out a little, letting the story continue at the same unhurried pace while allowing the ideas to settle more gently. Because by this point in human history, there is nothing left to prove and nothing dramatic waiting around the corner. Just long stretches of ordinary life where the body existed without being asked to represent anything beyond itself. For most ancient people, daily life was not something you curated or optimized. It was something you endured, repeated, and eventually accepted. And acceptance has a strange calming effect on the mind, because once something is accepted, it no longer demands constant attention. The body benefited from this acceptance more than anything else. It was not an image, it was not a project, it was not a problem waiting to be solved. It was simply the thing that got you through the day. Ancient societies did not wake up each morning asking how the body should appear to others, because appearance was not the primary currency of social survival. Reliability was. And reliability came from showing up, doing the work, and continuing to exist within the group without causing disruption, which meant the body could relax. Let's slow down inside another ordinary day, because ordinary days are where this story really lives. People wake up gradually. They adjust to the temperature. They move when they are ready. Clothing responds to the body, not the other way around. If it is hot, it comes off. If it is cold, it stays on. No one attaches identity to these adjustments. They are as neutral as eating when hungry or sleeping when tired. This neutrality is important because once neutrality disappears, the body becomes something you have to manage consciously, and conscious management is exhausting over long periods of time. Ancient people were already exhausted enough. They didn't have energy left over to monitor themselves constantly. Now let's drift into shared space again, because shared space shaped ancient comfort in ways modern people rarely experience. People lived close together. They worked close together. They rested close together. Bodies were unavoidable. And when something is unavoidable, it eventually stops being interesting. This is why ancient nudity did not provoke constant reaction. Reaction requires novelty. Ancient bodies were not novel. They were everywhere. Modern bodies are hidden, filtered, scheduled, and selectively revealed, which makes them feel significant even when they are not. Ancient life had no such filter. Now let's talk about pauses, because pauses are where the body either becomes loud or disappears. Ancient pauses were long, waiting for food, waiting for weather, waiting for others. During these pauses, people did not fill the time by turning inward. They sat, they rested, they watched the world. And while watching the world, the body fades from awareness. Modern pauses are short and filled, screens, thoughts, planning, which brings attention back to the self. Ancient nudity thrived in unfilled pauses. Now let's drift into the idea of effort, because effort defines how much attention the body receives. Ancient effort was physical, lifting, walking, working. Physical effort grounds attention outward. Modern effort is often mental, planning, comparing, evaluating. Mental effort turns attention inward. This is why modern people are hyper-aware of their bodies while doing very little physically. Ancient people were too busy being tired. Now let's sit quietly with rest again. Ancient rest was permissionless. You rested because you needed to. No justification required. Bodies rested openly. They stretched out. They took space. Modern rest often feels earned, scheduled, contained. And when rest is earned, the body never fully lets go. Ancient nudity fit naturally into rest because rest itself was not moralized. Now let's move gently into the evening. Light softens, activity slows, bodies loosen. Clothing loosens too, not as a statement, as relief. Ancient evenings were forgiving. They did not demand alertness. Modern evenings are often just extensions of the day, filled with stimulation and expectation. Ancient nights invited surrender, and surrender allows the body to stop performing. This is where ancient nudity felt safest, not because it was hidden, but because nothing was being asked of it. Now let's touch briefly on the idea of selfhood. Ancient people had identities, of course, but those identities were tied to roles, relationships, and survival, not to constant self-observation. Modern identity lives inside the body, how it looks, how it compares, how it is perceived. Ancient identity lived outside the body, what you did, who you belonged to, whether you endured, which meant the body could be imperfect without consequence. Now let's slow everything again just a little, because this is not a story about returning to the past. It's a story about remembering that discomfort with the body is not universal, not timeless, and not inevitable. It was shaped by changes in time, space, attention, and meaning. Ancient nudity was not a rebellion against rules. It existed before many of those rules were invented, and because it existed before them, it did not argue with them. It simply moved around them. So when we imagine ancient people naked or partially naked or unconcerned with exposure, we're not imagining confidence or freedom in the modern sense. We're imagining absence of concern, and absence of concern is deeply restful. That's why these long, slow descriptions tend to make the mind drift. There is nothing to resolve, nothing to fix, nothing to optimize. Just bodies existing inside time without commentary. So we stay with that. The voice keeps going, or it fades. Either way is fine. History does not need to end cleanly, and neither does thought. You can let it loosen, just a little.
All right, we're not entering anything new here, and that's exactly the point. Because most of human history exists in this wide, quiet middle space where nothing revolutionary is happening, nothing dramatic is unfolding, and nothing is being redefined on purpose. Which means daily life continues in long, repetitive patterns that slowly wear down the need to notice things that never really change, including the body itself.
Ancient life was dominated by continuity. Days followed days, seasons followed seasons, people followed the same paths, used the same tools, and occupied the same spaces for most of their lives. And when life is structured this way, attention naturally drifts away from what remains constant and settles only on what threatens that constancy. The body did not threaten it, so the body disappeared from thought. This is where nudity truly lived for most of history, not as a visible spectacle, not as a private indulgence, but as part of the constant background of existence, like dust in the air or the weight of the ground beneath your feet, something you were aware of only when it changed. Let's slow down completely and stay inside one long stretch of time, not a moment, not a day, but weeks that feel almost identical when remembered later. People wake. They eat, they work, they rest. Clothing moves in and out of this rhythm without friction. If it helps, it stays. If it doesn't, it goes. There is no pause where someone stands still and thinks about what their body might mean to others, because meaning is being spent elsewhere, on survival, on cooperation, on endurance, on getting through another cycle without loss. Modern people are often surprised by how little ancient societies wrote about nudity, as if silence implies repression, when in reality, silence usually implies irrelevance. You write about what disturbs you, you legislate what disrupts you, you moralize what causes tension. Ancient nudity did none of these things, so it passed unrecorded. Now let's stay with labor again, because labor fills most waking hours, and labor has a way of flattening all symbolic distinctions. When the body is engaged in sustained physical effort, it becomes a system rather than an image. Muscles work, breath adjusts, sweat forms. Clothing interferes with this system often enough that removing it becomes a practical decision, repeated so frequently that it stops being noticed at all. Ancient nudity is inseparable from fatigue, and fatigue dulls self-awareness. Modern nudity, by contrast, often happens in moments of heightened awareness, where attention is already turned inward, which is why it feels charged, fragile, and temporary. Ancient nudity lasted because no one was paying attention long enough to end it. Now let's drift through shared living spaces again, because architecture shapes awareness more than belief ever does. Ancient homes were porous. Sounds traveled, smells traveled, bodies traveled. People moved in and out of shared areas constantly, and in doing so, they carried their physical states with them without filtering or adjusting, because filtering requires privacy, and privacy was limited. And yet, this lack of privacy did not automatically produce discomfort, because discomfort comes not from being seen, but from being evaluated. Ancient evaluation focused on behavior, contribution, and reliability, not exposure. So, bodies passed through space quietly. Now let's talk about heat, because heat is one of the most honest forces in history. Heat removes ideology. When it is hot enough, rules collapse. Bodies respond, clothing disappears, and for most of human history, heat was not something you escaped indoors. You lived inside it, which means large portions of the year involved extended periods of undress that no one found remarkable because everyone was experiencing the same conditions at the same time. Modern people escape heat, air conditioning, fans, controlled environments, which means the body is no longer allowed to dictate its own state. And when the body loses that authority, tension builds. Ancient nudity was simply the body exercising authority over its comfort. Now let's slow down and talk about water, because water brings nudity into everyday life more consistently than almost anything else. Bathing, washing, cleaning. Ancient water use was communal, visible, and frequent. Rivers, baths, basins. Bodies entered and exited water in full view of others, not ceremonially, not erotically, but functionally, because water was a resource, not a luxury, and using it did not require emotional framing. Modern bathing is private, hidden, separated, which makes nudity feel like a special state rather than a functional one. Ancient bathing normalized naked bodies by sheer repetition. Now let's sit inside boredom, because boredom is where the body truly disappears. Ancient boredom was common, waiting for weather, waiting for harvest, waiting for others. During boredom, attention drifts outward. You watch insects, you watch shadows, you watch nothing. And while watching nothing, the body fades. Modern boredom is rare, and when it occurs, it is immediately filled. Phones, thoughts, distraction, which pulls attention inward again. Ancient nudity lived inside boredom. Modern nudity struggles to survive without distraction. Now let's drift into aging again, because aging bodies were visible constantly in ancient life. Older people did not retreat into private spaces. They remained present. Their bodies changed in full view. Wrinkles, weakness, scars, all visible, all normalized. This constant exposure prevented the formation of a single ideal body type because reality overwhelmed imagination. Modern people see aging bodies rarely and often only in controlled contexts, which makes aging feel abnormal. Ancient nudity included aging by default. Now let's talk about children one more time, because children anchor cultural norms more reliably than adults. Ancient children grew up seeing bodies constantly, different shapes, different conditions, which meant the body did not register as a mystery. Modern children grow up with selective exposure, which creates fascination, and fascination fuels discomfort. Ancient nudity dissolved fascination through familiarity. Now let's let the day stretch into night again, slowly, without ceremony. Light fades, bodies slow, clothing loosens or disappears, sleep arrives without ritual. Bodies cluster for warmth or spread out for comfort. No one is curating this. No one is observing it. It just happens. And because it just happens, it does not remain in memory. Modern people remember nudity because it interrupts the flow of life. Ancient people forgot it because it was part of the flow. This is the core difference, repeated again and again across centuries. Not freedom versus repression, not confidence versus shame, but interruption versus continuity. Ancient nudity belonged to continuity. Modern nudity belonged to interruption, and interruption always feels louder than it really is. So when we keep talking about ancient nudity in this slow, unbroken way, what we're really doing is recreating that continuity, allowing ideas to repeat, overlap, and blur, until nothing feels sharp enough to hold on to. And that is intentional, because sharp things keep you awake. Ancient life was dull in the best possible way, dull enough that bodies stopped demanding attention, dull enough that people could rest inside themselves without thinking about it. So we stay here, not at an ending, not at a conclusion, just inside the long, unremarkable middle of history, where the body was never the main character, never the problem, and never the thing that needed to be explained. It was just there, all day, every day, for a very long time.
All right. We're staying right inside the slow middle of history again. Not because nothing else exists, but because this is where most human lives were actually lived, in the long, unbroken stretches between big events, where no one felt the need to define themselves constantly, and where the body moved through space and time without ever asking whether it was doing so correctly. Ancient life was not organized around moments of self-awareness. It was organized around endurance. Endurance meant waking up and doing what needed to be done day after day, season after season, without expecting novelty, without expecting recognition, and without expecting comfort in the modern sense, which meant that whatever made the body's work easier, quieter, or more efficient was accepted without debate. Nudity fit into this logic naturally. It was not a philosophy. It was not a rebellion. It was not a lifestyle. It was simply one of many physical states a body could occupy while continuing to function. Let's slow everything down again and move through an entire day, not skipping anything, not highlighting anything, just letting it unfold the way it would have for countless generations of people who never once thought their daily routines would be narrated centuries later. Morning arrives without urgency. People wake because the light changes, because sounds shift, because bodies feel ready enough to move, not because an external system demands productivity at a precise moment.
Clothing is nearby, reused, imperfect, and unimportant. Some people put it on immediately, some people don't. No one notes the difference. Bodies stretch, adjust, and orient themselves toward the day's tasks. And because these tasks are physical, repetitive, and familiar, attention moves outward almost immediately, settling on tools, surfaces, animals, and weather rather than on the body performing the work. This outward focus is essential. When attention points outward, the body disappears. Modern people rarely experience this for long. Ancient people lived inside it. As the morning continues, work begins in earnest. Hands grip, feet move, muscles strain. Sweat forms naturally, and when sweat forms, clothing becomes inconvenient, heavy, and restrictive, which means it is loosened or removed without thought, without discussion, and without emotional framing. This happens again and again, so often that the act itself loses any sense of significance. Ancient nudity was not rare enough to feel special. It was not shocking enough to feel disruptive. It was simply present. Now let's sit inside the long hours of labor, because this is where modern imagination usually fails. These hours are not dramatic. They are tiring, repetitive, physically demanding. And when the body is occupied this way, it does not have the mental bandwidth to monitor itself constantly. There is no internal narrator. There's just movement. Ancient nudity existed inside this wordless physicality. Modern nudity usually does not. Now let's pause the work, not because it is finished, but because bodies need rest. People sit wherever it makes sense, on the ground, against walls, near shade. They remove anything that presses, rubs, or restricts, because rest is about release, not presentation. Bodies sprawl, limbs extend, spines curve. No one corrects posture, no one adjusts appearance. Ancient rest was not aesthetic, it was functional. This is important because when rest is functional, the body is allowed to be imperfect, and imperfection stops being noticed when it is universal. Now let's sit inside this resting moment longer than feels comfortable to the modern mind. Nothing happens. No stimulation, no entertainment, just heat, breath, and stillness. This is where the body truly disappears from awareness, not because it is hidden, but because it is uninteresting. Modern life almost never allows the body to become uninteresting. Now let's drift into shared presence again, because shared presence is where modern discomfort often gets projected backward unfairly. Ancient people were around each other constantly. They saw each other age. They saw each other weaken. They saw each other sweat, bleed, heal, and scar. And because they saw it all, none of it stood out. The body lost its novelty. And without novelty, shame has nowhere to attach itself. Modern people often confuse exposure with vulnerability. Ancient people experienced exposure without vulnerability because there was no audience detached enough to objectify what they were seeing. Everyone was inside the same physical reality. Now let's let the day move on slowly, not marking transitions too clearly, because ancient days blurred. Work resumed, rest returned, movement continued. Clothing went on and off as needed, responding to weather, effort, and fatigue rather than to symbolic meaning. No one paused to consider whether this behavior aligned with identity. Identity lived elsewhere, in kinship, in survival, in continuity. Now let's drift into the afternoon heat again, because heat strips life down to essentials. In hot climates, extended nudity was simply practical. In temperate climates, seasonal nudity emerged naturally. And because climate affected everyone equally, nudity was shared. Shared experiences lose their power to shock. Modern nudity often feels isolating. Ancient nudity was communal. Now let's sit with water again, because water repeats this pattern endlessly. People bathe together. They wash together. They enter and exit water without ceremony. Bodies glisten. Bodies drip. Bodies dry. All of it happens in full view. And because it happens often, it does not register as intimate. Modern bathing is intimate because it is rare and hidden. Ancient bathing was mundane. Now let's talk about boredom again, because boredom is misunderstood. Ancient boredom was not anxiety-producing. It was a natural state. People stared. They waited. They existed. During boredom, the body fades completely. Modern boredom is uncomfortable because the body becomes loud when there is nothing else to focus on. Ancient boredom made the body quiet. Now let's move into evening. Light changes. Activity slows. Bodies loosen again. Clothing loosens again. The day winds down without ceremony. People gather not to perform, but to be near. They eat. They talk quietly. They sit. Bodies lean against bodies. Touch exists without commentary. Ancient touch was common. Modern touch is rare, which again makes modern bodies feel louder. Now let's move towards sleep, slowly, without dramatizing it. Sleeping arrangements are practical. Warmth matters more than privacy. Bodies cluster or spread out depending on conditions. Clothing comes off because it traps heat, restricts movement, or feels unnecessary. Sleep arrives gradually. There's no final check, no self-evaluation. The body simply shuts down. And when it shuts down, identity dissolves with it. Ancient sleep erased the self nightly. Modern sleep preserves it. This is one of the quietest but most profound differences. Now let's step back slightly, not to conclude, but to widen the view. This pattern repeats, day after day, year after year, century after century. And because it repeats, it smooths. Edges disappear. Awareness dulls. The body becomes background noise, like breathing or blinking. Modern people often imagine ancient nudity as something bold. It wasn't. It was boring. And boring is peaceful. Peaceful enough that no one thought to write about it. Peaceful enough that it left very little trace in the historical record, which is why we have to reconstruct it slowly, indirectly, by looking at architecture, labor patterns, climate, and daily routines rather than explicit statements. The absence of commentary is the point. Ancient people did not comment on what did not concern them, and nudity, for most of human history, did not concern them. So we stay here, not at a turning point, not at a moral, just inside the endless repetition of ordinary human days, where bodies moved through time without asking permission, without narrating themselves, and without needing to be anything than what they already were. And that quiet, that repetition, that lack of urgency is exactly what makes this part of history so easy to drift through, because nothing is being demanded, nothing is being judged, nothing is being rushed. And when nothing is being rushed, the mind finally has room to rest. So we keep going, slowly, without an ending, just time passing the way it always did, long before anyone thought to question it.